So again, now back to our talk. With us today, we have a member of the EU Parliament who is driving forward the struggle between lobbyists of data collection, corporations, and citizens who are trying to find ways to secure their fundamental privacy rights. And he'll be talking to us today about that and some latest updates. So please help me welcome Jan-Philippe Albrecht.
Hi, thank you very much, first of all, for the nice welcome, and thank you all for coming. I'm Jan-Philippe Albrecht. I'm, as announced, a member of the European Parliament, and I'm rapporteur for the General Data Protection Regulation. And today I want to talk about the European Data Protection Reform, #EUDataP. And the title State of the Union is chosen because I think that the data protection reform is one of the most important procedures of the European Union's legislation. And I think that the question how it ends up and where it ends up is one of the most essential for the European Union's future. That's me, and you probably will never see me like that. I have been a journalist, a lawyer, and a politician, but most of my life I have been a politician. I'm representing the region here around Hamburg in the European Parliament, and I'm the lead negotiator for the European Parliament for the European Union's data protection regulation. The European Union's data protection reform. So why do we need it? Why do we reform our data protection legislation in the European Union? First of all, we need to update the rules which are originated from 1995. So the legislative process was from 1990 to 1995 or 1994, a process which is before the internet as a mass media was existing in the minds of most people, and before also politicians got aware of the internet. So these rules need to be adjusted. It doesn't mean that these rules from 1995 are completely wrong. I think that the principles which are laid down in the rules in the directive from 1995 are basically right. The principles and definitions, the idea, the concept of data protection, it was not the first time, I will come to that, where those rules were written down. So they are in principle right, but obviously those are not brought into practice for the internet environment, and we need to find new ways to interpret these principles in the light of the digital age. Second, we need stricter enforcement. Stricter enforcement because in today's situation, around 15, 20 years after this directive came into force, the enforcement of these rules is almost zero. That's my personal view, because in most of the situations of your data processing activities, wherever you are situated in the European Union, these rules are not, or these processings are not going in accordance with the rules set out in these general EU rules, and the rules which are applicable, nobody really knows what they are, if it's the Irish, the Swedish, or the Austrian data protection law, and nobody really has a certain interpretation of what it means to apply these rules. So what we need is a better enforcement of these rules, and especially one thing needs to be fixed, and that's closing the loopholes. Loopholes in the meaning that in the internal market of the European Union, there have been 28 different data protection laws. This is the situation of today, and it opens up for companies to move where they see the least or less regulation in Europe, so they can just choose for the least protection for us. And that's a huge loophole, forum shopping. And of course, in the interpretation of these laws and the implementation into national laws, there are quite a lot of loopholes because of very different wordings, very different interpretations by local or national courts. Then, of course, this leads to legal certainty. The question if we can trust in what the rules on data protection are about is one of the most important questions, not only for citizens and consumers, but also for business and for authorities. So legal certainty is the basis for a functioning rule of law system, functioning fundamental rights and rules for the market. And in the market, of course, it's the most important trust. Without trust, we will not get the development of technical, innovative formats, new data processing possibilities. We will have a fallback into nationalization of the online environment and in blocking markets and closing markets. And then, of course, data protection in Europe is a fundamental right. I will explain that in a minute, but safeguarding a fundamental right, of course, is one of the most important tasks for the European Union today. We need to have legislation which makes fundamental rights practically enforceable and meaningful and not only written on the paper. And we need to set a standard by the EU and export it, because data protection as a concept is something developed in Europe and something already implemented by quite a lot of states worldwide, but still there's a huge gap and there's still a lack of acceptance for data protection as a fundamental right and these standards on the global level. One example, the United States, where you cannot find such a fundamental right implemented in the way how it is in the European Union, and where there are no general data protection rules, but only privacy rules for authorities. And then, of course, this leads to the biggest question, the biggest task for us, and that's leading my political activity in the European Parliament, the transformation to digital and global society. So the transformation of our rules of values, of what we have been trusting on for years and centuries, into what is the digital and global society of today already. So the development of data protection and privacy laws goes back at least until the 60s. Of course, the concept of privacy is an old one and a centuries old, but this is the history of the development of data protection and privacy laws. Starting from the debates on registers in the United States, which, by the way, came by some soldiers situated in Hesse to Germany and led to the first data protection law worldwide, the Hessian Datenschutz Act in 1970. And then 4 years later, the US Privacy Act was adopted, applicable, as I said, only to public authorities. And there you already see that there's a different development in Europe and in the United States, which is the privacy protection, protection from invading your privacy on the American side, and data protection, so the so-called self-determination or informational self-determination in Germany, and then afterwards in most of European countries during the 70s and 80s. On that, you have also the OECD guidelines based on those concepts and the Council of Europe's Convention 108, which then was implemented in all the EU member states of today. So that was the starting for European standards. And then the well-known census judgment of the German Constitutional Court on the 15th of December 1983, so almost exactly 30 years ago, where it was mentioned very clearly already in 1983 that data protection is about protecting every data processing activity, because every data processing activity, no matter where and from whom it's taking place, it can have an impact on our fundamental right on self-determination, personality right, our dignity. It's deriving from human dignity. And then the EU came up and the European Union started to legislate on these fields, especially in view of the ongoing digitalization. As I said, the Fundamental Data Protection Directive 1995, and then first rules for the online environment, the EU Privacy Directive, e-Privacy Directive, with the famous cookie provision, and just to mention it because it belongs there, in 2006, the Data Retention Directive, which at the moment is in front of the European Court of Justice. Then something which is completely underestimated by most of citizens in Europe, but also worldwide, that there has been something like an EU constitution passed in 1st of December 2009. It came into force, the Treaty of Lisbon. And the Treaty of Lisbon had a specific provision on data protection in Article 16. So since the 1st of December 2009, there's a specific mentioning in the Treaty of the European Union that everyone has a right to the protection of personal data concerning them. And that's a clear sentence. And second, the European Parliament and the Council, acting in accordance with the ordinary legislative procedure, shall lay down the rules relating to the protection of individuals, and compliance with these rules shall be subject to the control of independent authorities. More specific, with the Fundamental Rights Charter, which also was declared binding for all EU member states with the Lisbon Treaty, and don't listen to British lawyers that there could be an opt-out, it doesn't apply. This Fundamental Rights Charter is applicable for all EU member states, and Article 8 says clearly, again, everyone, meaning, just to note, it's a human right, not only a citizen's right. Everyone has the right to the protection of personal data, so data protection, not only privacy protection, concerning him or her. Second, such data must be processed fairly for specific purposes, purpose limitation, and on the basis of consent or of some other legitimate basis laid down by law, meaning that data processing in the EU is only lawful, only allowed if it's based, one, on consent, or second, on a specific law. Everyone has the right to access to data. Some journalists really feel quite surprised when I say in Europe the right to access your data is a fundamental right. It's written in the Fundamental Rights Charter. You can ask whomever which personal data he or she has collected about you, and the right to have it rectified, including, of course, the right to deletion. And the independent authorities, of course, is a very important issue of EU law, and that's something which has been enforced vis-à-vis Germany, for example, once. But at the end, the enforcement is a problem. So who's the European Union? What are they doing? So this is a famous picture of how people see the European Union. Quite a bureaucratic bloc and unknown officials working on our future. Just half of the truth, this is the other half. It's also a democracy. This is the parliament in which I work in. Somewhere I'm sitting there. You will not point me out, but there you have 766 members of the European Parliament. They are deciding about the legislation in the European Union. But that's also half the truth. The real decisive people, so the decision makers, are sitting in these two rooms. On the left side, you have the Justice and Home Affairs Committee in the European Parliament. Only few people sitting in. That's normal. You have sometimes only 5-6 people caring about the legislative act. And on the right side, the Justice and Home Affairs Council of Ministers. So those are the main bodies deciding about the rules in the European Union. That was just some excursus on how the legislative process works. Just to let you know that lead negotiators, as mentioned, myself on the data protection regulation, and then there's a directive on law enforcement. I will explain that, which is led by Dimitris Drutsas, a Greek member of the European Parliament. And on the side of the Council, you have rotating presidencies. First half 2014 will be the Greek presidency, starting from 1st of January, and then the Italian presidency, 1st of July. So that's the year of 2014, and there, in these two rooms, there will be the decisions made on our privacy and data protection in Europe and worldwide. So what happened until now? From 2009, so starting from the Lisbon Treaty to 2011, there was a consultation process. The European Commission already has to do a consultation process before introducing new laws on the repeal, on the possible repeal of the Data Protection Directive from 1995. In July 2011, at the end of this consultation process, the European Parliament also passed through a resolution asking for first one single EU standard for data protection on the basis of the Directive 1995, so not lower. Second, strengthening of individual rights. Of course, it was a bit more sophisticated, but I will come to the points later. And third, sharp sanctions and consistency in enforcement in the European Union and by all the European Union's authorities and the European Union's member states' authorities, and of course, all the companies. So this is about a market regulation or market location principle. These demands and the results of the consultation process then ended up in the proposal by the European Commission in January 2012, so last year in January. Two files were presented, one a regulation on data protection for almost all the sectors and a directive excluding the law enforcement authorities from it. A directive means it has to be implemented in EU law. So still, after pass through a directive, member states of the European Union are implementing it in their national laws. A regulation doesn't do that. The data protection regulation would be directly applicable for the whole European Union, 500 million citizens and a huge internal market. No transposing law for member state anymore, and direct application by data protection authorities in Europe and by the courts, national courts, and in last instance, European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. In March 2012, then the rapporteurs in the European Parliament were appointed, so my work started. We did hundreds of hearings, meetings, discussions since, and in January 2013 presented draft reports, so our recommendations as rapporteurs for the changes to the Commission proposals, and collected the amendments by the other members of the European Parliament, by the political groups. And in October 2013, so 2 months ago, we voted on the European Parliament's position for negotiations. In almost unanimously, it was voted almost unanimously, and it opened the negotiations with the Council in a window of opportunity until March, April 2014. If we will not conclude negotiations with the Council until then, the European Parliament will go to a plenary vote. So some details on the process. First of all, this was literally the biggest lobbying tsunami ever in Brussels. So me and my staff, we had hundreds of meetings with lobbyists. Alone in 9 months of 2012, we registered 168 meetings. We published all of them on my website. It was, I would say, 80–90% lobbying by industry, and the rest shared by very different interest groups coming from civil society, authorities, or unions, whatever interest groups, non-industry. Some of them were understandable concerns, like SMEs should be overburdened, so we don't want the bakery to have overburdening duties by these data protection rules, while we could ask why a bakery anyhow should process personal data. But that was very often the example. And of course, the right to be forgotten, huge debate which is still going on, and where there are very different ideas and concerns. But of course also some just way over the top. So there have been quite a lot of concerns trying to completely eliminate data protection as the concept as we have it today, undermine the fundamental rights which are in our constitutions, that European data protection should not apply to this or that area, or not to our business or whatever, that data processing should be possible without the consent of citizens under the term of legitimate interests in several regions, and the scope of data protection as such should be reduced. So those, we had to face those concerns, of course, and those were brought in quite a lot of them by lobbying groups trying to approach European parliamentarians with hundreds of amendments to be sent in. And at the end, there were hundreds or even thousands of amendments sent in, completely copy-pasting proposals by industry groups or other interest groups. Most of them, of course, companies like Amazon, eBay, Facebook, Google, coming from Silicon Valley, or the American Chamber of Commerce, their representation in the world somehow. You can find it on this website. Those data journalists did an overview and they still do it. It's very helpful for European legislation as it's quite complicated to understand how decisions are made. At the end, we had 3,999 amendments to deal with. So that was what we had on our table in around March this year. I don't know the number of the pages, so but you can imagine it's quite a lot. It was hundreds of pages, and that as a Green is quite hurtful to see, because these 3,999 amendments in the European Union need to be translated in 23 official languages. So the first meeting scrutinizing these amendments in our committee, you remember the room I showed you, where that every place had such a staple of amendments on its table, and the parliamentarians had to first of all read all of them. Of course, not all of them did, but we had to find the compromises and to find solutions for the core issues. So what have been the core issues in all these debates? First of all, the definitions. What is personal data? That's the central question of data protection. So questions like how to deal with IP addresses, how to deal with RFID IDs or cookie IDs, etc. So we managed to cover most of those in the definition. We still managed to hold the definition quite broad. Second point, of course, also the question, what means personal data which leads to identification or which leads to an identifiable information? Should there be an addition that identifiable also means singling out someone? We managed to hold the discussions on that, and at the end had some signal that this is also covered, and hopefully this will also be prevailing in the negotiations with the Council of Ministers. Thank you. The second big point is consent. So the question, how needs consent to be given if you use the justification for your data processing that there's consent? It has to be specific, it has to be informed and explicit. That was a huge fight in the European Parliament. At the end, we got the explicit consent in the position of the European Parliament, and that's quite a success in my view, because the way to undermine consent during the last 5, 10, or even 15 years was already made, and it's already going on. So we need to work on that, and that was one of the core issues we need to tackle. And the scope of application, of course, was one of our greatest concerns. First of all, that we have a market location principle. I already referred to it. So this means that the European Union sets its EU data protection standards in a way that it's applicable to whomever is acting on the European Union's territory or whomever is acting on the European Union's market. Both of it. Which means that if there's a company based somewhere in China acting on the European market through online business, for example, it's applicable. Which means it's a territorial, extraterritorial application of our rules. I think that this is the main change of these laws, because it's saying clearly, for the European Union, we have to safeguard the right to data protection wherever. we can. And that we do by market regulation. Second question, not so big, but interesting. The EU institutions have been regulated already by a regulation. So there was a question how to include those in the protection of these new regulations. Quite a technical task, but at the end we managed to do so in a transition provision. And even more important again, the private and household exemption. So the question, what does it mean to be exempted by these data protection rules because I'm doing data processing in the course of my own private and household activities? The question which role gainful interest plays, where it's clear that if there's gainful interest, if there's private or household activity still, it should be covered by this exemption. On the other side, it should be clear that if you act in a way that it's not usually seen as to be a private activity or a household activity, you should be in the duties again, of course. Next issue, legitimate interest. I already referred to it. Legitimate interest is one of the most important loopholes in the existing protection. Because in the directive from 1995, it was clear that legitimate interest can be a legal ground for processing, but it was not further defined. So there were very different interpretations in EU member states. While in Austria, you have to opt in to almost everything, and legitimate interest is absolutely the exception. In the UK, it's the other way around. So this is the way where we came from and where we needed to debate about the question how to reduce the scope and the possibilities for data processing under legitimate interest. And we brought in the idea of saying that legitimate interest always has to meet the reasonable expectations based on the relationship with the data controller. So my reasonable expectations should play a central role. It shouldn't be a company which I never have seen and never have had contact to, collecting my personal data just because it thinks it's legitimate interest. The second big point in this scope was the direct marketing issue. Direct marketing issue is one of the most important debates because there's most money in. And most growth opportunities today are based on direct marketing with personal data. There are different starting points in the EU member states, and what the position in the European Parliament now brought at the end as a differentiation was that in the internet, only for all non-similar goods and services, direct marketing can be a legitimate interest. And only in the analog environment, if you do direct marketing by snail mail, in most EU member states, it's already today that you can do it as legitimate interest, send letters to whomever. This is a huge lobbying fight, of course, and I would have liked to reduce it even more. I would have liked to say, I don't want your mail, but unless I say, yes, I want it. But at the end, we got this, and still important is that an opt-out is always possible. So analog and digital environment, of course, you get your opt-out wherever it is, and it always needs to be there with highly visible information, and there's also an incentive to have do not track possibilities and technologies developed and certified. Next point, profiling, a very important debate because in the current legal frameworks, profiling doesn't play such a very important role. It's automated processing, which concerns me always or confuses me always because automated processing seems to be everything today. So profiling is in the heart of what we need to regulate, and we brought in a specific article on the limitation of the use of personal data for the purpose of profiling and for profiling as such also. In addition, privacy by design and default has been brought in as new concepts, and those are safeguarding a very important fundamental principle of data protection, which is data minimization, and that's, of course, still in. Last important core issue on substance, the data protection officer, which is a concept deriving from the example of the German law, where you have a data protection officer mandatory for companies having more than 9 persons dealing with data processing. And we got away from the Commission's proposal to change that to 250 employees because it doesn't make sense. And now the proposal is that if there's data processing on 5,000 data subjects per year or more, then there should be an appointment of a data protection officer. And of course, this has to be proportionate to the tasks. So it can be part-time, it can be external, but it's clear that it helps with compliance and that it also helps the data protection authorities and gives less burden to consultate with them. The international transfers, I come to that also a bit later because it was, of course, impacted by the Snowden revelations. Now have to be clearly based on EU law. So there should be a clear restriction to only what's in the regulation is possible to be transferred. And of course, there are justifications and minimum requirements which have to be met to transfer to third states. Then the consistency, so the consistent application of these data protection rules in the European market or on the European market and in all the EU member states by the so-called first one-stop shop, which means what is already today the case, that a company which has a main establishment on the European market has a competent authority for enforcement and oversight on this company. For example, Amazon, based in Luxembourg, Luxembourgish Data Protection Authority is competent for Amazon for the enforcement. So that's a one-stop shop for the company, but we also brought in the idea of having a one-stop shop for us, so that we can go to our own data protection authority wherever we are in the European Union. And these data protection authorities then have to cooperate, have to find a common position on the interpretation of these single data protection standard on the European market. And that helps for consistency, and it helps in a specific case, which I will point out in a few minutes. At the end, a final decision in case of conflict is possible in accordance with the Parliament's position. So if there's a conflict between data protection authorities, for example, a specific authority is not at all acting, or a specific authority has an interpretation which is completely outrageous, then a two-thirds majority of data protection authorities can overrule a decision by the competent data protection authority. I think that this cooperative model is the best approach I've seen until now. It's safeguarding the independence of data protection authorities. It's not building up a complete centralized system in which you have to contact someone who is completely out of your region, but it also helps for consistency, which is the main issue here, because the loophole, as I said, of forum shopping in the European Union is one of the biggest problems we have. And the most famous example is the loophole Ireland. That's the loophole Ireland. This building is somewhere in the suburbs of Dublin in Ireland, and the shop on the left side is a supermarket, and the shop on the right side is the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. The Irish Data Protection Commissioner is competent, for example, not only, but for example, for the company Facebook Ireland. The company Facebook Ireland is the main establishment or the main company which all the people, all the users are in or contracting with when they are not based in the US or Canada. So you could say Facebook worldwide, and then you have Facebook US Canada. Facebook worldwide is overseen by this authority. That led to the situation that once there was an Austrian student called Max Schrems, and he sent in a simple request for access his personal data by Facebook. So just asking, what personal data have you retained on me, Facebook? And he sent that letter and got no answer. And then he sent a letter to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner and got no answer. And quite a lot of weeks later, and other contact approaches, he got a reply that there would be now negotiations on his case. And after certain conversations, he got a DVD by Facebook with 1,222 pages personal data retained by Facebook on him. And quite a lot of it was not known by him, that it exists, that he has put it into the system of Facebook, and quite a lot of it he believed, or he was sure, that he already clicked on delete. So it was all there. There were plenty of data protection infringements. He was studying exactly this. The group of students dealing with data protection laws, they saw 22 different infringements, cases of infringements, and started a campaign which is named Europe versus Facebook. And in this campaign, they started to complain against Facebook in front of the Irish Data Protection Commissioner. And it took weeks and months, and it still takes weeks and months to get these problems sorted out. They are not now waiting for the final answer of the oversight authority after having sent in all these questions already, I think, 1 or almost 2 years ago. And nothing happened since then, or almost nothing. And they are waiting now the answer of this commissioner, and obviously this answer will not be in accordance with the EU data protection law. So that's what he expects, and what he, I think, realistically can expect. And that means that he then has to go to court. The competent court will be the Dublin court. The Dublin court system is very complicated. You need a specific lawyer which is trained on filing court cases in front of Irish courts, and they are quite expensive. So now at the moment they are fundraising around 300,000 euros to start this complaint and get easy things like the right to deletion of your own personal data enforced. So this may take years, and that's the reason why the system of the EU Data Protection Directive from 1995 and the implementation into national laws has failed. Because the EU Commission, which normally is competent for the enforcement of these directives vis-à-vis the member states, failed to, at the end, really enforce it. So the whole thing turned around in the legislative procedures, but then, of course, the Snowden effect came with June, July, where we already believed that before summer we will not really get a breakthrough with the negotiations, and it would take even longer after summer to get these data protection reform done. But then after summer we came back and there was at least a little effect. So what were the effects? First of all, the strategic effect that there is now a competitive advantage for data protection seen by average users or politicians. Here you can see an article on the on the lacking encryption on Google servers, and an ad for Google Cloud Hosting just right beside it. So it has an effect. People are realizing it, and at least privacy is high on the political agenda again. But at the end, we all see, and that was also the conclusion of Glenn Greenwald yesterday, lots of promises, but little meat. So there's not really much happening. What we got through here in the European Parliament was, first of all, the famous Article 42, which was in an article in a previous preliminary draft of the European Commission, saying clearly that, as I said, international data transfers need to be based on European law, meaning clear that a Patriot Act order or a FISA Act order would not be a valid legal ground for an international transfer from the European Union to a third state. I have to say thank you to Edward Snowden, because we brought this article back into the position of the European Parliament after his revelations, and it's still in there, and the European Parliament has voted almost unanimously on it. That means that companies acting on the European market will have troubles if they send personal data out of the European Union if it's not based on EU law. And at least that will help, hopefully, to set a global standard. We have reached a sunset clause for the Safe Harbor Declaration, so adequacy ratings of the European Union vis-à-vis third states or sectors, Safe Harbor vis-à-vis the US market or US companies, need to be repealed after a certain time frame after this regulation gets into force. We have blocked the proposals to introduce binding corporate rules for processors, because we see, of course, this has to be in the hand of the controllers of those companies dealing with the consumers or the citizens. And we introduced at least a general framework for whistleblower protection in this data protection regulation. That's an important step and hopefully an example for other areas. And what we achieved, and that's quite important, we achieved fines up to 5% of the global annual turnover. In the preliminary draft of the European Commission, it was up to 4%, then watered down to 2% after the American Chamber of Commerce did heavy lobbying on the European Commission. European Parliament now lifted it up to 5% of global annual turnover. That's quite significant, at least half of what companies can be fined to than with competition law. And that's quite a heavy thing if you get into trouble with European competition law. So on the core issues, we have to say that there was not such a huge impact, but we managed to already, before the Snowden revelations, bring through most of the core issues. And I think that now it's up to the ongoing debates. What of this position of the European Parliament will prevail in the negotiations with the Member States and the Council? So the overall result in the European Parliament is for sure a very good compromise. It's compared to the lobbying and the amendments much better than I or many of us have hoped for. And that in the view of a structural majority of conservative and market liberals in the European Parliament. By the way, the next European Parliament will be even worse. But this result is quite good. It's supported from all political groups in the European Parliament. Only the right-wing extremists haven't voted in favor of it because they don't vote in favor of anything. But it's of course also understandable that civil rights activists like with EDRI and those here cannot be 100% happy. I'm too not happy 100%, but I think that others are even less happy than we. So what's next? We're waiting for the Council of Ministers to adopt their position. It's going around in circles in the Council because there is since 2 years now a debate going on without any real results. Some helpful allies are France, Poland, Austria, and Greece, member states, in which those debates take place. And at least in Poland, the ACTA debates have really changed something in the political landscape. A bit disappointing is that Germany is not in the round of these allies in favor of data protection, but one of the delaying countries, together with companies like the UK, Denmark, Hungary, and Slovenia, which don't want the regulation at all, but Germany is one of those, some others also saying there are lots of questions, and that they are saying since 2 years without proposing alternatives. That's diplomat speak for delay until it's dead. So what we can see is now that the Council will turn its rounds again and again, and the question is what scrutiny we will have towards the EU governments, the member states' governments, with regard to their activity in the European Council of Ministers, if we will get a good data protection reform or not. the big picture, European data protection reform will not solve all the issues, but a level playing field on the whole European market and as a market location principle for the global market and better data control for us is something significant we can win with it. With regard to the intelligence surveillance, I really recommend to watch out for the EP inquiry, so the European Parliament's inquiry on the mass surveillance on EU citizens, which I'm coordinating together with some other members of the European Parliament, and we will present or vote our report in January 2014, so next month, end of next month. We will start the voting procedure on that, and there will be a workshop on day 3 tomorrow at the same time as this lot is, at the Noisy Square Assembly. What we need is joint effort for EU IT capabilities. I think that there needs to be initiative, the whole stack from processor design to open software, open source, and a free open approach helps security for sure. That is what I also learned with Rudy's talk on encryption. I think we need to fight for open source. What we also need is a digital New Deal. We need to invest in privacy. We need to invest into alternatives, and that's something we need to demand from politicians also. And at the end, it's about quite a huge thing for democracy. It's about safeguarding our self-determination. Not only self-determination as citizens in a free democracy, in a rule of law-based democracies, at least here in Europe, in the US, anywhere in the world, and also as consumers in a global market which is more and more taking our self-determination away because of lack of enforcement of privacy rules, and that's quite fundamental. So what we need is such a reform as a start for a digital declaration of independence. We need someone to start with, and this is of course, a start, and we do not have the majority on global level. If you look at the global level, there's a majority of states repressive, non-democratic. It is completely naive to believe that we will manage to get global standards done today. We need to fight for standards on supranational level. We need to fight for standards like the European data protection reform to get it done on the global level and to get pressure on other global players. And we have the power here in Europe. We still have the majority. It could change, but that's what we need to work on. And we have privacy activists around the world watching us, watching the European Union. We got letters from the huge civil liberties group in Northern and Southern America to go ahead, because they believe it's only the European Union who could do a significant step to improve the legal framework for data protection. And it's the best chance we get today. And last but not least, it's a race against the clock. Forum shopping takes place, as I said, in the fewest cases you can trust on your own jurisdiction to be applied, to be a safeguard for you, and it will be even worse with more and more market opening and deregulation approaches like TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is not a problem only because of data protection, but also because of our fundamental rights, data protection, privacy. And so we need to regulate as soon as possible to safeguard something for the future. And as I said, Parliament and Council in the European Union will both decide in spring 2014 on significant waypoints. So I ask you all to get active right now. And it's starting today. Right after this talk, there will be a demonstration, Freedom Not Fear. I was asked to just invite all of you to get to the entrance and have a short protest of 1 hour for privacy outside of the Congress.
Great, thank you, Jan. That was very insightful. I can see that we have a bunch of questions, so we're going to open now the floor for interaction from you guys. So we'll take first microphone number 2.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate your work, and I thank you very much for your efforts. And I see it as a big work to increase our freedom. And so most people think that, that your work in the European Parliament just produce more rules for us. So I think the big chance would be here to make everything easier, to make very strict laws of data protection, and this is good for the people to understand them, and so you get the support of the people in the country. So this is the big chance. Then second point is our right to access our own data from my side would be very clear to a demand to the companies to not only give the authorities a backdoor in their systems, but to give me a front door in the systems, so that I can see what, as a demand, what data is stored from mine, and I can say delete. And if this is too much work for a bakery to provide this, then they shouldn't store my data. And you said that there's a decision to make it opt-out in the systems. I worked in the direct marketing business. When someone answers on this, then you have the okay, that this address is active, and then the spam increases in this way. So the opt-out should be mandatory with the deletion of all the data that are stored there. And most of the direct marketing agencies are very small, so this number of employees that you propose there will never apply for a system that they should have a data protection commissioner because they are small agencies. So put this number down, please. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you.
I would like to answer just shortly. You have seen that we changed the number of employees to the number of data subjects, so that would include those smaller companies. And for all the rest, I completely agree with what you have said. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. We'll take one question from online.
Question from IRC. What can Parliament do against passive or active sabotage by Commission and Council, for example, through international agreements, for instance, like in the current surveillance hearing?
So I understand it's about international agreements passed through by European Commission and European Council, or the Council of Europe, Council of the European Union. So international agreements like on passenger name records, like on SWIFT banking data, have been concluded to transfer personal data between the European Union and the US. International agreement or European agreements exist for data sharing inside the European Union. The European Parliament has played a very important role in that, safeguarding redress opportunities and proportionality with regard to data protection. Again and again, we rejected some of those agreements as the European Parliament. After the Treaty of Lisbon, the European Parliament has to give its consent to all of these agreements, especially international agreements. So nothing can work without the European Parliament. So the focus has to be on the European Parliament representing the interests of European citizens, or of all citizens, of humans having a human right on data protection, and we need to ask them to do that. The problem is there's one field where the European Parliament has no influence, and that is national security, intelligence, because that's only reserved for the member states of the European Union. It's a black hole of the rule of law in the European Union. You could even have a drone attack filed from Poland to Slovenia and justified it by national security. I think that's unbelievable, but therefore we need to change the treaties.
All right, we'll take question from microphone number 1.
Hi, thanks for the work. I was wondering whether you have also thought about how to deal with some of the situation at the data protection authorities, because they are vital in the overall role to actually enforce the regulation. And specifically, my concern is that in most member states, they are way too small. And second, they actually have very few technical staff who understand internet technologies. So mostly lawyers, 90% of lawyers there. That makes it really difficult to actually address the fundamental issues rather than trying to deal with some specific urgent cases that show up in the media. And on top of that, You mentioned sort of more ID in Europe and privacy-friendly ID, and that's also for most of the directorates general. You don't have computer scientists in management positions, so you actually have a lack of understanding. And to make it even worse, if you look at the current procurement process by the EC, you can't even procure for technologies developed, for example, by the IETF, because those are not recognized. And that's even where most of the internet technology comes from, or W3C. So there's a more subtle problems that follow after that step, and I'm hoping that you or someone else also takes a look at this and how to actually get this to a working system.
I completely agree to that, and there's an ongoing fight for the resources of data protection authorities. As with all the authorities and all resources today, it's quite complicated, and still the member states have their budget competence, so it's all about the budgets in the member states, how good equipped data protection authorities are. But I think that we really need to work of having experts wherever personal data processing is taking place. And therefore, the approach of having the data protection officer in almost every company is a first step, I think.
All right, we're going a little bit over time, Jan. If you don't mind and the audience doesn't mind, we can take a few more questions. Okay, maybe one more from the IRC or Twitter?
We have one more from IRC. Can you estimate how much more the voice of one single well-funded lobbyist counts compared to, for instance, a regular citizen sending an email to their representative?
Very good question. I cannot answer completely, but what I know, is that the Silicon Valley, both in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels, holds one of the biggest lobbying resources ever. They influence completely jurisdiction and legislation on both sides of the Atlantic, and for years we took that as something not being critical. And I think that we should change, because they are very huge companies and they have quite a lot of resources to invest, and they don't need to say openly what their interest is. They just need to fund some things, from some movements, some associations or lawyers having specific interpretations. But if I hear Eric Schmidt saying that privacy is an anomaly and anonymity is dangerous, and this company is one of the biggest companies in the world, investing in research, in lawyers, in associations all around the world, then you can see how lobbying has an influence on the actual decision-making process. It's not only in the digital industry, but of course you have it with pharmaceuticals, you have it with tobacco, but it's taking place, and that's democracy. It's sad that it's that way, but what we need is a critical public asking for transparency, and critical MEPs or members of parliament, members of Congress who try to follow what is reasonable and not only what is said more often.
Great, brilliant, thank you. We'll take the gentleman at microphone number 4.
Thank you. So if I followed the talk right, since 1995 there's been a right to data privacy in the European Union, but in 2013 we're sort of still talking about whether that right is supposed to continue as opposed to how implementations of that may work out. So I'm asking about how do you see possible implementations of the right, whether they exist, when they might exist, and specifically whether any thought has been given to an existing data protection regime that is copyright or Urheberrecht that already is in the courts, like we understand how to work this, and whether we could apply this to personal data that, say, shows up in all these databases of the internet companies.
I didn't get completely the question, but I would understand it in a way that you ask about, does the right to privacy, right to data protection change significantly, or is there a way to really better enforce it?
So the right is more of an abstract concept, right? But so the right to privacy is like, you know, you have a right, but what are you going to do about this? This case of this Austrian student who is fighting the legal battle in Ireland, right? But the process is not well understood or well established, whereas for copyright infringements, there's already a well-established, well-understood process.
Okay, I got that.
Okay.
So, yeah, it's clear that the enforcement is taking place where the interests are. So, and the interests to data protection is only shared by consumers and citizens. That's different with IP enforcement, for example. But what I see is that there's a general question behind, which is enforcement in the digital environment. And that is something which we need to talk about, which we need to approach in a way that it's not going back to nationalistic fragmentizing of the internet environment and of arbitrary blocking of content, for example, but in the direction of clear rules to be applied by data controllers and to be asked for by data subjects in an environment like a common market, or even in an extraterritorial approach where a territory where the server is, for example, has to be regulated. So that's the way how we do it, but the problem is still that there's no real concern of other entities at the moment than citizens and consumers, and that we need to change, of course.
Great, thank you. I think we'll take the gentleman at microphone number 3, and then one online, and then 2 and 1, and go around. All right, all yours.
Thank you. Great talk. I have 2 questions. One is, when do we get criminal provisions so that we can also get to individuals who do something against the law and make all those extradition treaties work for us instead of against us? And the second one, how about a global approach, something rooted in international law, like a digital high seas treaty with a court and stuff like that? Wouldn't that perhaps solve the problem, also the resource protection problems and stuff like that?
Very good questions. The first question, we have criminal law provisions, for example, for cybersecurity. We just passed it. We didn't completely like them because, of course, they were slightly trying to criminalize those people who gather here. But what they are helpful against is, for example, access to information systems also by third states entities or by companies towards other companies, so spying, for example. And I think that should be used by us more. We should turn around the table, say, listen, the GCHQ does cyber attacks on the Belgacom system in Belgium, and they should be punished for that. I mean, there should be a criminal procedure against.
Eric Smith, data terrorist.
I didn't get that.
Oh, Eric Smith, data terrorist.
Yeah, okay, terrorism. I don't like that term, but anyway, the second thing I forgot already. International treaties, of course. Yeah, I mean, I'm completely in favor of international approach. At the end, I would like to have an international treaty of fundamental rights, which is completely enforced everywhere, consistently applied, and so on. But I just told you that this will not happen. I mean, we have the United Nations and we have a human rights culture, but I mean, in practical meaning, it doesn't mean anything at the moment, you know? So the problem is that we need to get rule of law, jurisdiction which is applicable in practical meanings, where we have redress possibilities and real activities to be taken. And that's possible at the moment in some areas of law, of legislation, and we should use the opportunities we have to then, at the end, build the pressure for international agreements as far as possible. I don't think that a different approach is possible at the moment. If the big powers in politics fail to regulate multilaterally important questions for them, like external security, whatever, then we will not manage to do that for privacy. But we will manage by building up the pressure from all around the globe, by building up systems which work and which practically give enforcement and security for us as citizens and consumers.
Thank you. Signal Angel, do you have a question from our online viewers?
Yes, there's a question from IRC. How does the upcoming TTIP deregulation undermine privacy rights or will make it harder to defend and extend them?
That's a good question where I can just start with a sentence which I forgot to say to the last question, because of course we need to also insist on international agreements, on standards internationally. I don't think it should exclude each other. What we have, for example, at the moment is the Transatlantic Data Protection Framework Agreement, negotiated since 2 years. Since 2 years, we tried to get the United States government to agree on the protection of privacy for non-US citizens or residents, because the Privacy Act only protects US citizens and residents. And that we need to change. We need to have the fundamental right, the human right notion, like it in the EU Treaty and the EU Fundamental Rights Charter, into the US law. That's what we need to achieve and what we try to achieve in the European Parliament. And I think that TTIP, the trade agreement, is endangering these approaches if TTIP would include debates on issues like fundamental rights or data protection. Therefore, I say that the TTIP negotiations should be reduced in scope on technical standards in many regions, but not there where it's about fundamental rights, for example, data protection, because we need to work on standards there. What TTIP does is mutual recognition. What is mutual recognition? Mutual recognition says, okay, the United States says, you Europeans, if you sell products to our market, we accept that you have your own standards. But if we sell products to your market, you have to accept that you have to follow our standards. So that's not the way how we do it, because that's just a race to the bottom. It's undermining the standards which exist, because it's always a competitive disadvantage if you have standards and if you have higher standards, because of course it's always a burden for trade, it's always a burden for those who want to sell the products. So that we need to get away from, and therefore I ask us all to oppose the TTIP negotiations, because I don't think it's helpful.
Great, thank you. Speaker at number 2.
Yes, I want to thank you very much for the great work you're doing in the European Parliament. I represent the beekeepers in Europe, and the Green Party in the Parliament has helped us win many lobbying battles, and it's important that you're there. Thank you so much for that. But my question goes back to the trade agreement issue, because you indicated that we have a race against the clock, because if these trade agreements are in place before the European regulations are in place, then the companies may be able to go to an arbitration panel and see any rules instituted after the TTIP is in place as an unfair trade barrier and seek compensation from the taxpayers. There is an issue, though, that we may already be losing this race against the clock, because the EU has already concluded a free trade agreement with Canada. And as long as these internet companies have a significant entity in Canada, they may already be entitled to such investor protections. And as a member of the European Parliament, I already asked your colleagues, because they are in the GMO and pesticide area, there are probably similar problems. As a member of the European Parliament, in the rapporteur position, do you have any idea what is in the agreement that has already been negotiated between Canada and the EU?
It's a problem. I mean, we oppose this agreement due to the reasons you already noticed. I think that the investment security provisions are the most dangerous for democracy worldwide. Unfortunately, we as Europeans are doing it with third states already. You mentioned Canada, but there has been more unequal agreements like the free trade agreement with India. And I think that there's only one opportunity to oppose those ideas of investor security provisions in these agreements, because it just means that you reduce the scope of democratic decision-making in our democratic states. And I don't think that this is a valid provision. Companies shouldn't have a reservation that they can say what can be law and what not, but it should be the democratic debate which should decide about that. So in the Canada provisions, there are some of these provisions already in. It's a problem, and it could be a precedent for TTIP. And of course, they will use it, and they, by the way, tried to negotiate, the US negotiators, in the Canada-EU negotiations. That's how it goes all the time. They know how to negotiate quite good. So the issue is that there is a majority, structural majority, on both sides of the Atlantic in favor of it, because of jobs and growth. And that's a debate which is longer than what we have right now. I mean, we need to think about a way how we can improve awareness for these problems, especially with regard to technologies, and how we can create awareness for the political procedures.
But that means, is the mic on?
Sorry, I don't want there to be a ping pong back and forth. Just allow other people to speak. The young man at speaker number 1, please.
Okay, hi. Thanks for doing more than your job. And question is simple: does it apply to agencies as well, or just companies? And how to enforce that in the future?
To agencies?
Yes,
Which
national agencies and public.
It depends on the nature of the agency. I mean, yeah, public administration. Okay, so the data protection regulation will apply to all public administrations which are not law enforcement or national security. For law enforcement, there's the directive, and for national security, as I said, black hole.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry I have to leave, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jan. Thank you all for your questions. I guess it's break time. Just make sure to take your things with you.